Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 16, The Rise of the Irish Free State. To understand everything is to forgive everything. Up till the end of April, we seemed to be ploughing our way heavily but surely through all our difficulties. The Free State government seemed to be functioning fitfully but increasingly, and the party and parliamentary situations in England held. All our hopes and aims were directed towards the free election by the Irish people of a representative assembly. There was no doubt whatever that by an overwhelming majority they were for both the treaty and for the Free State government. Towards the end of May, a new and, to me, a most disconcerting development took place. On May 19, Mr. Griffith had told the Republicans in the Dale that in their violent courses they did not represent 2% of the people of Ireland, and that the course that they were pursuing placed them on the level of the worst traitors in Ireland, namely those who, by their actions, were rendering the return of the English troops inevitable. The very next day, to the astonishment of all, to the dismay of their friends, and to the joy of every enemy, a compact was signed between de Valera and Michael Collins. The compact dealt with the approaching election. It comprised an agreement that the Republican anti-treaty men, who Mr. Griffith had declared the day before did not represent 2% of the Irish people, were to have 57 seats in the new parliament as against 64 for the supporters of the treaty. They were not to be opposed by the provisional government to the extent of 57 seats. In other words, the existing balance on the question of accepting or rejecting the treaty was to be preserved in the new parliament and was not to be disturbed by any contest between members of the Sinn Féin party. Secondly, this compact prescribed that after this so-called election, a coalition government should be formed consisting of 5 pro-treaty ministers and 4 anti-treaty ministers, with the President of the Assembly and the Minister at the head of the army additional. On this basis, the two Sinn Féin parties, pro- and anti-treaty, were to divide the representation and challenge the candidates of every other opinion. I had received news a few days before of what was in the wind, and I wrote immediately to Michael Collins. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Collins, May 15, 1922. I have received information which leads me to believe that among the subjects being discussed between you and the irregular or Republican party is the proposal that there should be an agreed election, that is to say, an election at which there would be no contests, but at which Mr. de Valera would be accorded 40 seats and the provisional government 80. I think I had better let you know at once that any such agreement would be received with worldwide ridicule and reprobation. It would not be an election in any sense of the word, but simply a farce, where a handful of men who possess lethal weapons deliberately to dispose of the political rights of the electors by a deal across the table. Such an arrangement would not strengthen your own position in the slightest degree. It would not invest the provisional government with any title to sit in the name of the Irish nation. It would be an outrage upon democratic principles and would be universally so denounced. Your government would soon find itself regarded as a tyrannical junta which, having got into office by violence, was seeking to maintain itself by a denial of constitutional rights. The enemies of Ireland have been accustomed to say that the Irish people did not care about representative government, that it was alien to their instincts, and that if they had an opportunity, they would return to a despotism or oligarchy in one form or another. If you were to allow yourself to be misled into such an arrangement as is indicated, such action would be immediately proclaimed as justifying to the full this sinister prediction. As far as we are concerned in this country, we should certainly not be able to regard any such arrangement as a basis on which we could build. I do earnestly hope that you will put me in a position to deny these most injurious reports. At any moment questions may be asked in Parliament on the subject. I see already that the Daily Chronicle has referred to it in a leading article. I beg you will show this letter to Mr. Griffith and to Mr. Duggan, to whom, as co-signatories of the treaty, I am bound also to address myself. So we were not, it seemed, to get any foundation after all. It was common ground between Republicans and Free Staters, regulars and irregulars in the IRA, Catholics and Protestants, landlords and tenants, Unionists and Nationalists, from one end of Ireland to the other, that the dominant wish of the Irish people was to take the treaty, to work it honorably, and to restore under its aegis the dignity and prosperity of Irish life. But they were not to be allowed to express their opinion. The Irish masses, just like the Russian 2 or 3 years before, were not to be allowed a voice in their fate. They were to be led by the nose, by a tiny minority making an immoral deal among themselves and parceling out the nation as if they were cattle. This was more baffling than any of the raids and outrages. It threatened to reduce the whole situation to a meaningless slush. We were, however, on this issue in possession of the ensigns of democracy. Until you get a certain distance down the slope, these count for much. We invited the Free State leaders over to London. They came immediately. Griffith plainly in resolute dissent from what had been done. Collins half defiant, half obviously embarrassed. It was all right, he said. We did not know their difficulties. These were hideous and indescribable. Nothing was stable under their feet. A contested election was physically impossible. It would mean widespread civil war. No one would dare to vote. They had not the strength to keep even the semblance of order. Nevertheless, Collins declared himself unchanged in general intention to stand by the treaty. It looked as if the wounds of Ireland would not react to any treatment known to science, but would just slough away into mortification. These events produced their immediate reaction in the north. Protestant Ulster was convinced that Southern Ireland would now sink into chaos, and to wall themselves off from this infection was the only thought. Incessant demands were made for troops and arms. Sir James Craig made an uncompromising statement about the boundary. Mr. Churchill to Sir James Craig, May 24, 1922. Londonderry will tell you the results of his discussions with the War Office and the arrangements which we have made for the supply of this great mass of material to you. I must say at once, however, that I do not consider your declaration made without any reference to the government that in no circumstances would you accept any rectification of the frontier or any boundary commission as provided for in the treaty is compatible with requests for enormous financial aid and heavy issues of arms. While I was actually engaged in procuring the assent of my colleagues to your requests, you were making a declaration which was in effect in one passage little short of a defiance of the imperial government whose aid you seek. Several of my colleagues have communicated with me this morning in strong protest against a statement of this kind being made by you when you are asking for and receiving our assistance, and especially at so critical a moment in Irish affairs. All I was able to reply was that De Valera and Collins had made statements in the Dáil yesterday of an equally unsatisfactory character. The effect of such a statement on your part is to make it far more difficult for the imperial government to give you the assistance you need, and also it robs the ministers, who will meet the provisional government representatives, of any effective reproach against Mr. Collins for the contemptuous manner in which he has spoken of the treaty. It has enabled many newspapers in England, on whose support we should have to rely if the worst comes to the worst, to treat the whole Irish situation on the basis of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. A very strong effort will undoubtedly be made in favour of a policy of Britain disinteresting herself entirely in Irish affairs, leaving them to stew in their own juice and fight it out among themselves. Such a disastrous conclusion is rendered more difficult to combat by a statement of the kind you have made. I know you will not mind my speaking quite plainly, because I am doing my best to support you in all that is legitimate and legal. We could not have complained, for instance, if you had said that the Collins de Valera agreement rendered all cooperation between you and the South impossible. I should have regretted such a statement, but it was entirely one within your rights to make. But it is not within your rights to state that you will not submit to the treaty which the British government has signed in any circumstances, and at the same time to ask the British government to bear the overwhelming burden of the whole of your defensive expenses. I cannot understand why it was not possible to communicate with me before making a declaration in this sense. I should have thought it would have been quite possible for you to have made a thoroughly satisfactory declaration to your own people in these critical times without taking ground which seems to show you just as ready as Collins or de Valera to defy the imperial government if they take a course you do not like. You ought not to send us a telegram begging for help on the largest possible scale and announce an intention to defy the Imperial Parliament on the same day. P.S. I have just received your telegram and am very glad to know that you are relieved by the decisions which I have been able to procure on your behalf. While not by any means giving up hope, I thought it right to prepare Parliament for a slattern development, and on the motion of the Whitsuntide adjournment, I laid the whole story before the House of Commons, repeating the most valid of the explanations which Mr. Collins had offered. The provisional government could not possibly guarantee the ordinary security or life and property if these securities were challenged by an active, ardent, violent Republican minority. This Republican minority, it is explained, consists mainly of a comparatively small number of armed men, violent in method, fanatical in temper, but in many cases disinterested or impersonal in motive. But behind these, strengthening these, multiplying these, disgracing these, are a larger number of common, sordid ruffians and brigands, robbing, murdering, pillaging for their personal gain or for private revenge, or creating disorder and confusion out of pure love for disorder and confusion. These bandits, for they are nothing else, pursue their devastating course under the so-called glamour of the Republic and are inextricably intermingled with bona fide Republican visionaries. The provisional government declared that they found themselves unable to deal with these bandits, while at the same time they were engaged in armed struggles with bona fide Republicans. They declared that the agreement into which they have entered with the Republicans would isolate the brigands and would enable these brigands to be struck at and suppressed, that a greater measure of liberty and security would immediately be restored, and that such conditions are an indispensable preliminary to any free expression of the political will of the Irish people, to which they look forward at an early date. They say further that it is in the power of the extreme minority in Ireland, by murdering British soldiers or ex-soldiers, or Royal Irish Constabulary men who have retired from the constabulary, or Protestants in the south, or by disturbing Ulster, to produce a series of episodes which, if prolonged and multiplied, would in fact destroy the relationship between Great Britain and Ireland and render the carrying through of the treaty impossible on both sides. I urged the House not to underrate this argument. I added this warning. Irish prosperity has been seriously affected. Banking and business are curtailed. Industry and agriculture are languishing. Revenge is only coming in with increasingly laggard steps. Stagnation and impoverishment are overtaking the productive life of Ireland. The inexorable shadow of famine is already cast on some of its poorer districts. Will the lesson be learned in time, and will the remedies be applied before it is too late? Or will Ireland, amid the stony indifference of the world, for that is what it would be, have to wander down those chasms which have already engulfed the great Russian people? This is the question which the next few months will answer. I strove again a silent tide of skepticism. I do not believe that the members of the provisional government are acting in bad faith. I do not believe, as has been repeatedly suggested, that they are working hand in glove with their Republican opponents with the intent by an act of treachery to betray British confidence and Ireland's good name. I am sure they are not doing that. They may not have taken the wisest course, or the strongest course, or the shortest course, but they and a majority of Dáil Éireann, who steadfastly support them and support the treaty, are, I sincerely believe, animated by an earnest desire to resolve to carry out the treaty. Not only Mr. Griffith and Mr. Collins, the two leading men on whose good faith we took this memorable departure, but the other ministers who are in this country, Mr. Cosgrave, Mr. Kevin O'Higgins, and others, have repeatedly declared their adherence to the treaty and have renewed their personal assurances while they have been here with us in the strongest manner. They have argued vehemently that the course they are taking, questionable and doubtful as it appears to British eyes, as it must necessarily appear to almost any eyes, is the surest way and indeed the only way open to them of bringing the treaty into permanent effect. Whether their policy and methods are right may be questioned. Whether they will succeed or not is open to doubt. But that they are still trying to do their best to march forward on that path which alone can save Ireland from hideous disaster, we firmly believe. Some here may think we are being deceived and hoodwinked, and by being deceived ourselves are deceiving others. If we are wrong, if we are deceived, the essential strength of the imperial position will be in no wise diminished, while the honor and reputation of Ireland will be fatally aspersed. Whether you trust or whether you mistrust at this moment, equally you can afford to wait. We have done our part. We are doing our part with the utmost loyalty before all the world. We have disbanded our police. We have withdrawn our armies. We have liberated our prisoners. Here there were scornful interruptions. Yes, I say it and I boast it. We have transferred the powers of government and the whole of the revenues of Ireland to the Irish ministry responsible to the Irish Parliament. We have done this on the faith of the treaty, solemnly signed by duly accredited plenipotentiaries, for such they were, of the Irish nation, and subsequently endorsed by a majority of the Irish Parliament. This great act of faith on behalf of the stronger power will not, I believe, be brought to mockery by the Irish people. If it were, the strength of the empire will survive the disappointment, but the Irish name will not soon recover from the disgrace. Mr. Asquith, my old chief, rising equally above party and above passion, threw the whole weight of his authority upon the side of the government. Then the House separated in sombre mood. On that very day, however, a new incident, which I duly reported to the House, had occurred. The townships of Pettigo and Belleague had been seized and occupied by Irish Republican forces. Pettigo lay astride the border and Belleague was wholly in Northern Territory. This military affront brought into play the other side of the dual policy I was endeavouring to apply. It gave me the opportunity of reassuring Ulster that we were not merely sliding with apologies down the slope, but that whatever else went to wreck, the integrity of their territory would be protected. The Secretary of State for War and my other colleagues on the Cabinet Committee were in full agreement. Immediately after the debate, Michael Collins, who had listened to it, came to my room. I mentioned to him amicably that if any part of the Irish Republican Army, either pro-treaty or anti-treaty, invaded northern soil, we would throw them out. He took it quite coolly, and seemed much more interested in the debate. "I am glad to have seen it," he said, "and how it is all done over here. I do not quarrel with your speech. We have got to make good or go under." We argued a little about Pettigo and Beleg, and about Belfast atrocities. Before he left, he said, "I shall not last long. My life is forfeit, but I shall do my best. After I am gone, it will be easier for others. You will find they will be able to do more than I can do." I repeated the phrase of President Brand, which I had learned in the days of the Transvaal Constitutional Bill. "Alles sal recht kom." All will come right. I never saw him again. Here I will record a few thoughts about this man, Michael Collins. He was an Irish patriot, true and fearless. His narrow upbringing and his whole early life had filled him with hatred of England. His hands had touched directly the springs of terrible deeds. We had hunted him for his life, and he had slipped half a dozen times through steel claws. But now he had no hatred of England. Love of Ireland still possessed his soul, but to it was added a wider comprehension. He had come in contact during the treaty negotiations with men he liked, with men who played the game according to the agreed rules. He had plighted a new faith to act fairly by them. As Griffith seemed to rely especially upon Mr. Austen Chamberlain, so Michael Collins was deeply impressed by the personality of Lord Birkenhead. The transition of his sympathies can be followed in gradations through his speeches by anyone who cares to study them. Whereas he had had only one loyalty, he now had two. He was faithful to both. He died for both. When in future times the Irish Free State is not only the home of culture and of virtue, not only prosperous and happy, but an active, powerful, and annihilating force in the British Commonwealth of Nations, regard will be paid by widening circles to his life and to his death. Large bodies of troops, equipped with all the appliances of war, were now set in motion on the Ulster border. About 7,000 men with cannon and armed launches advanced upon the villages of Pettigo and Beleg. A demonstration was made of overwhelming force in support of indefeasible rights. For more than 10 days a British village, having every right to claim protection from the Crown, had been continually in lawless occupation of Irish Republican forces. After all, there are occasions when 100 aggrieved armed men are entitled to expel one wrongdoer in his shirt. The Prime Minister was disquieted by this development. He feared that we were being maneuvered by the extremists on both sides into giving battle on the very worst ground. If the Free Staters insist upon a constitution which repudiated Crown and Empire and practically set up a republic, we should carry the whole world with us in any action we took. But an issue fought on Ulster would not command united British opinion, still less worldwide support. "I understand," he wrote, "we are marching against a rotten barracks at Beleg, garrisoned by a friendly blacksmith and a handful of his associates. But MacEwan, the blacksmith, is a strong treaty man and has publicly denounced De Valera and the pact. If he should be killed at Beleg, it would be a disaster to the cause of reconciliation with the Irish race. Quite frank, if we force an issue with these facts, we shall be hopelessly beaten. There will be great die-hard shout, which will last for a very short time, but we shall have no opinion behind us that will enable us to carry through a costly strangling campaign. Let us keep on the high ground of the treaty, the Crown, the Empire. There we are unassailable. But if you come down from those heights and fight in the swamps of Loch Erne, you will be overwhelmed. You have conducted these negotiations with such skill and patience that I beg you not to be tempted into squandering what you have already gained by a precipitate action, however alluring the prospects may be. Mr. Churchill to the Prime Minister. I was in train of answering your letter when it was superseded by events. Ballick village and fort were occupied today by strong forces. Pursuant to our orders, the village was reconnoitred first by an armoured car, and not until this reconnaissance had been fired upon while in Ulster territory and from points in Ulster territory did the troops advance. About 20 shell and 400 rounds were fired. On one shell bursting near the fort, its garrison of 40 fled without loss of any kind. The blacksmith to whom you refer had not left Dublin according to Mr. Griffith. As far as we know, the battle has been almost bloodless. One soldier has been slightly wounded and no enemy casualties have been found or prisoners taken. I am issuing a communiqué explaining that the operations are at an end, that our troops will advance no further, that no further fighting will take place unless they are attacked, that communications are being made to the Provisional Government with a view to establishing peaceful conditions on this part of the border, and that as soon as we are assured there will be no further incursions, the British forces will be withdrawn wholly within the Ulster borderline. It is always difficult to deal with a small urgent local situation without compromising grave general issues, but I do not think the action taken will have evil results. I hope indeed it may have had good results, and I am quite sure that we could not have met the House of Commons on Monday with the admission that we did not know what was going on in a British village and did not dare go there to find out. The results of this operation, which threaded its way so narrowly between tragedy and ridicule, were salutary. Ulster felt that if it came to actual invasion, they would certainly be defended. The Irish Republican Army realized that we should not hesitate to levy open war, and the Free State government knew that at any rate one line was drawn which could not be transgressed. Not the slightest ill will was manifested by those Free State leaders with whom we were in relation. On the contrary, they seemed fortified in spirit for the very serious crisis which was soon to supervene. Meanwhile, the terms of the Irish constitution were being worked out in detail by the Provisional Government in Dublin. There had been many suggestions, open and covert, that the constitution would be within the four walls of the treaty. Extremists in Ireland looked forward to it as likely to provide the occasion for a breach. In England everyone was at his limit, and the fires of wrath were double-banked. Fortunately, though not without hard words and much argument, an instrument which both parties were able to accept was produced, and the apostles of violence were once more disappointed. The text of the Irish Free State Constitution was issued on June 15, and the next day the electors of Southern Ireland went to the poll. In spite of the farcical and indecent compact and the absurdities of proportional representation, the voting of the treaty was heavy. The figures were pro-treaty Sinn Féin 58, Republicans 36, Labour 17, Farmers 7, Independents 6, and Unionists 4. On a plain issue and a free vote, hardly any of the opponents of the treaty would have been returned. The result was masked and confused by the compact, and no sure foundation was established. Nevertheless, the form of the constitution to which the Free State leaders had agreed was such as to preclude Mr. de Valera and his followers from sharing in the government. A pernicious duality in the executive was thus avoided. A few days later a resounding crime was perpetrated. Sir Henry Wilson, after completing his term as Chief of the Imperial General Staff, had been elected a Member of Parliament for an Ulster constituency. It had also been freely stated in the newspapers that he would act as the military advisor of the Ulster forces. Had he not, in fact, taken any part in their executive affairs? Two Irishmen living in London, one of them a messenger in a government office, regarding him as the commander of the hostile army and personally responsible for the murders in Belfast, waylaid him on his doorstep in Eaton Square and shot him to death with their pistols at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of June 22. He had just returned from the unveiling of a war memorial and was in the khaki uniform of a field marshal. He fell, pierced by numerous bullets, on the doorstep of his home. The murderers took to flight, but every human being on the spot, although unarmed, spontaneously pursued them. They retreated for some distance, firing at the gathering crowds. However, there was no escape. Everyone rushed upon them from all sides. They were seized and hurried to Gaol to await the certain and speedy doom of British law. The effect of this murder in the heart of London of a man renowned throughout Europe as a strategist and also of a member of the House of Commons was profound. The murderers do not seem, according to our present knowledge, to have been directed by any Irish organization. They exploded independently, but Great Britain reacted with the same sudden anger as had followed the murders in the Phoenix Park nearly 40 years before. The late Field Marshal was carried to his grave on the following Monday with the highest military honors. All the way to St. Paul's Cathedral, dense crowds thronged the streets. I had to face the House of Commons in the afternoon. I had thought out most carefully the arguments to use, and in spite of the intensity of feeling, I was allowed to unfold them fully. I surveyed with extreme plainness the good and bad points in the Irish situation. I paid a tribute to the memory of Sir Henry Wilson, the substance of which is embodied in the 3rd volume of this account. I described the growing strength of the Ulster government and our plans for placing a complete cordon of imperial troops across Ireland to separate the north from the south. I dwelt upon the will of the Irish people as manifested by the election, but all of this would have been futile apart from the following. I should not be dealing honestly and fully with this subject if I left in the minds of the House the impression that all that is required is patience and composure. No, Sir, firmness is needed in the interests of peace as much as patience. The Constitution which we have seen, which has been published, satisfactorily conforms to the treaty. It has now to be passed through the new Irish Parliament. There is no room for the slightest diminution of the imperial and constitutional safeguards and stipulations which it contains. That is not all. Mere paper affirmations, however important, unaccompanied by any effective effort to bring them into action, will not be sufficient. Mere denunciations of murder, however heartfelt, unaccompanied by the apprehension of a single murderer, cannot be accepted. The keeping in being within the Irish Free State by an elaborate process of duality, merging upon duplicity, of the whole apparatus of a republican government will not be in accordance either with the will of the Irish people, with the stipulations of the treaty, or with the maintenance of good relations between the two countries. The resources at the disposal of His Majesty's government are various and powerful. There are military, economic, and financial sanctions, to use a word with which we frequently meet in continental affairs. There are sanctions of these kinds which are available, and which are formidable. They have been very closely studied, and the more closely they are studied, the more clearly it is seen that those measures will be increasingly effective in proportion as the Irish government and state become more fully and more solidly organized. Hitherto we have been dealing with a government weak because it had formed no contact with the people. Hitherto we have been anxious to do nothing to compromise the clear expression of Irish opinion. But now this provisional government is greatly strengthened. It is armed with the declared will of the Irish electorate. It is supported by an effective parliamentary majority. It is its duty to give effect to the treaty in the letter and in the spirit, to give full effect to it, and to give full effect to it without delay. A much stricter reckoning must rule henceforward. The ambiguous position of the so-called Irish Republican Army, intermingled as it is with the Free State troops, is an affront to the treaty. The presence in Dublin in violent occupation of the Four Courts, of a band of men styling themselves the headquarters of the Republican executive, is a gross breach and defiance of the treaty. From this nest of anarchy and treason, not only to the British Crown but to the Irish people, murderous outrages are stimulated and encouraged, not only in the 26 counties, not only in the territory of the Northern Government, but even, it seems most probable, here across the Channel in Great Britain. From this centre, at any rate, an organisation is kept in being which has branches in Ulster, in Scotland and in England, with the declared purpose of wrecking the treaty by the vilest processes which human degradation can conceive. The time has come when it is not unfair, not premature, and not impatient for us to make to this strengthened Irish government and new Irish Parliament a request, in express terms, that this sort of thing must come to an end. If either from weakness, from want of courage, or for some other even less creditable reason, it is not brought to an end, and a very speedy end, then it is my duty to say, on behalf of His Majesty's Government, that we shall regard the treaty as having been formally violated, that we shall take no steps to carry out or to legalize its further stages, and that we shall resume full liberty of action in any direction that may seem proper and to any extent that may be necessary to safeguard the interests and the rights that are entrusted to our care. The subsequent debate was marked by the intervention of Mr. Bonar Law, who had retired from the government and from the leadership of the Conservative Party in April 1921. Whose health was now restored, and whose political influence was a factor of first importance. The Colonial Secretary, at the end of his speech, did everything which I would say you could ask the government to do, or any government to do today. His attention was called to what is happening in the Four Courts. I do not think anyone could have read the letter issued from that quarter without the same feeling of abhorrence as was expressed by the Colonial Secretary, but there was something else in it more likely than anything to arouse our horror. The reference to Sir Henry Wilson's death, in which they said they did not do it, clearly implied that they found no fault with it. Just think of this. There is in Dublin a body which has seized the Four Courts. To make the irony more complete, it is the centre of justice in Ireland. And from these Four Courts, undoubtedly emissaries are going out, trying to carry out in Ulster precisely the same methods which they think succeeded in the south, and are instigating murder in every direction. Is that tolerable for a moment? Let the committee think what it means. Suppose we found out that there was a body occupying an important position in Paris, which was openly subsidizing murderers to come to this country and upset our government. What would happen? We should not make representations in Paris and say, "We must make sure you do not approve of it." We should say, "You must stop this or there is war." Are we to be in a different position in that respect towards what appears to me to be one of our own dominions? I do not think there is any man in this house who does not realize what a terrible thing it would be if we were reduced again to try to secure order in Southern Ireland by that means. Now the position is clear. Much time cannot elapse before these grave matters, to quote a saying of the colonial secretary, are brought to the test. I for one say that I believe the government means to see this through, but if they do not, I will be against them, and I hope the House of Commons will be against them also. Later in the evening, the Prime Minister and I met Mr. Bonar-Law in the lobby. Although always holding himself in strict restraint, he manifested an intense passion. As far as I can remember, he said, "You have disarmed us today. If you act up to your words, well and good. But if not—" Here, by an obvious effort, he pulled himself up and walked away from us abruptly. The Cabinet, supported by the House of Commons, were resolved that whatever happened, Rory O'Connor must be put out of the four courts. The only question was when and how, and this must be promptly settled. Orders were actually sent to General Macready. However, this officer prudently, and as it turned out fortunately, counselled delay, and at this darkest hour in Ireland came daybreak. On June 27, Rory O'Connor's band, ranging cheerfully through the streets of Dublin, kidnapped General O'Connell, Commander-in-Chief of the Free State Army. Michael Collins, under the pressure of this event, and having doubtless learned that if he did not march we would, determined to attack the four courts at dawn. All authority in Dublin was quaking, but he had his own following among the IRA. He asked for the loan of 2 18-pounder guns from General Macready, and upon instructions from London, these were delivered. He had one capable, resolute officer, Dalton by name, who had seen much service in France. This man fetched the guns from the British camp, and working them with his own hands and half a dozen untrained men, opened fire at 4 a.m. on June 28. Then followed one of those comic tragic conflicts which were characteristic of the Free State Civil War. Both sides laughed and respected each other as dear comrades in arms. Both were ready to die if it could not possibly be avoided, but much more ready to expend ammunition than blood. Lavish rifle fire directed at the walls of buildings broke out, interspersed by expostulations and appeals to the higher nature of man. Commandant Dalton, half of whose gunners were wounded, continued to hurl shell into the four courts, and this cannonade was in fact the salute which celebrated the foundation of the Irish Free State. 2 more guns were asked for and supplied during the afternoon, and by evening all the ammunition, modestly limited to 200 rounds, was exhausted. It is surprising that at this crisis General Macready, who had so often shown good sense and comprehension, should have professed himself unable to supply any more. The Provisional Government were told they must wait until a destroyer from Carrickfergus could arrive with further supplies of high-explosive shells. On receiving this news, they very nearly collapsed. Frantic appeals and threats were made to me that night over the telephone, and every resource was used to hasten the supply. It appeared, however, that the Commander-in-Chief was unwilling to encroach even for a few hours upon the ample supplies of his defended camp. 200 or 300 rounds would have been ample. His 16 batteries had nearly 10,000 shells of various natures, of which half were high explosive. On the 30th, the Free Staters, having with great circumspection gained a footing in a portion of the four courts, Rory O'Connor set it on fire and, after an explosion, which caused some loss of life, surrendered with his followers. A mass of papers, of legal importance and historical interest, some of them dating from the 13th century, were destroyed, and the dome of the building collapsed amid its ruins. Fighting went on for several days in Sackville Street and became fiercer as it progressed. But by July 5 all rebels actually in arms against the Provisional Government had surrendered. This week's fighting was the decisive event in the birth struggles of the Irish Free State. When reduced to the last gasp, that infant organism had reacted timorously but violently, and had gained new strength with every effort. A hard line was now drawn between friend and foe, and mortal hatreds were exchanged. The provisional government, menaced by imminent assassination, fortified themselves under trusty guards in Marion Square. They lived together for some weeks without ever returning to their homes. Mr. Kevin O'Higgins told me some years later how some of them sat one evening in an angle of the roof for a little fresh air, how in lighting a cigarette he inadvertently raised himself for a few moments above the parapet, and how the bullet from a neighboring house cut the cigarette from his fingers. But these men, although deeply troubled in their souls, were courageous and hot-blooded, and driven as they had been into a corner with their lives at stake, and far more than their lives, the course they had conducted so far, they hit back with primordial freedom. On July 12 they issued a proclamation threatening drastic reprisals against all attempts at murder. They nominated a war council under Michael Collins and set on foot active, aggressive operations against their enemies all over Ireland. Thus began the Free State Civil War. It was a very curious war, conducted by a few people who knew each other extremely well, who knew where to find each other and what the other man was likely to do in given circumstances. Collins and his adherents set to work to hunt down and kill those who they knew were compassing their destruction. In this guerrilla most of the best-known gunmen lost their lives. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Collins, private and personal, July 7, 1922. I have not troubled you during these anxious days and have confided my messages to your practical requirements. But the events which have taken place since you opened fire on the four courts seem to me to have in them the possibilities of very great hope for the peace and ultimate unity of Ireland, objects both of which are very dear to your British co-signatories. I feel this has been a terrible ordeal for you and your colleagues, having regard to all that has happened in the past. But I believe that the action you have taken with so much resolution and coolness was indispensable if Ireland was to be saved from anarchy and the treaty from destruction. We had reached the end of our tether over here at the same time as you had in Ireland. I could not have sustained another debate in the House of Commons on the old lines without fatal consequences to the existing governing instrument in Britain. And with us the treaty would have fallen too. Now all is changed. Ireland will be mistress in her own house, and we over here are in a position to safeguard your treaty rights and further your legitimate interests effectually. As soon as you have established the authority of the Irish Free State throughout the 26 counties, as I do not doubt you will in a short time, and have placed yourself and your colleagues at the head of the great mass of the Irish nation, a new phase will begin, far more hopeful than any we have hitherto experienced. In this phase the objective must be the unity of Ireland. How and when this can be achieved I cannot tell. But it is surely the goal towards which we must all look steadfastly. There will be tremendous difficulties, vexations and repulses, and no doubt any premature hope will be disappointed. But I have a strong feeling that the top of the hill has been reached, and that we shall find the road easier in the future than in the past. We must endeavor to use the new strength and advantages which are available to secure broad solutions. Minor irritations, however justifiable, must not be allowed to obstruct us or lead us off the track. Craig and Londonderry are coming over here on the 13th. I have not worried them with the various complaints, some of which are undoubtedly justified, contained in your letter of the 28th of June. The Viceroy has reserved the bill abolishing proportional representation in the North for the royal assent, which means that we shall have time to talk it all over. Otherwise I wish to keep the ground clear in the hopes of a general return at the right moment to the governing idea of the Collins-Craig Pact. You remember how Mr. Griffith wrote it all over the blotting pad in my room. There is the key to the new situation. We must wait till the right moment comes and not fritter away growing advantages by premature efforts. I will write to you after I have seen Craig and Londonderry again. I think I can get a better result in friendly conversation about your various complaints than by nagging them in official correspondence. Meanwhile, in the intervals of grappling with revolt and revolution, I think you should turn over in your mind what would be the greatest offer the South could make for Northern cooperation. Of course, from the imperial point of view, there is nothing we should like better than to see North and South join hands in an all-Ireland assembly without prejudice to the existing rights of either. Such ideas would be vehemently denounced in many quarters at the moment, but events in the history of nations sometimes move very quickly. The union of South Africa, for instance, was achieved on a wave of impulse. The price is so great that other things should be subordinated to gaining it. The bulk of people are slow to take in what is happening, and prejudices die hard. Plain folk must have time to take things in and adjust their minds to what has happened. Even a month or two may produce enormous changes in public opinion. Please give my good wishes to Mr. Griffith and show him this letter if you will. P.S. I hope you are taking good care of yourself and your colleagues. The times are very dangerous. Mr. Churchill to Sir James Craig. Private and Personal, July 7, 1922. Very great events have taken place in Southern Ireland since we last met, and I am sure you will have been pondering over their consequences. The framing of a satisfactory constitution for the Irish Free State, the clear wish of the Irish people recorded at the polls in spite of so many difficulties, the determined suppression by force of arms of the Republicans in Dublin and the campaign against them now being launched all over the country, particularly in Donegal. And lastly, the appeal made to Irishmen generally to come forward in support of the government. All these constitute a series of stepping stones towards a far better state of affairs than we had any right to hope for a few weeks ago. I know you and Charlie, Lord Londonderry, will be on the lookout on your side for anything that can turn these favourable events to the general and lasting profit of Ireland and of the Empire. We want quiet and we want time, in order that the new situation may sink into people's minds and in order that the superior solutions, which may now be possible, may occur naturally to many people. I see all your difficulties over the Boundary Commission. And as you know, we have on 2 occasions got Collins to agree to alternative methods of procedure. It may well be that after he has won his fight in the South, he will be in a position to make you a much broader offer, which will render the intervention of the Boundary Commission unnecessary, and which will secure the effective cooperation in your government of all the best of the Catholic elements in Ulster. Meanwhile, I trust you will not have to make any references to the subject of the Boundary Commission, which might suggest the possibility of a conflict between you and His Majesty's government. We really have got to work these things out together, and I feel increasingly hopeful that we shall succeed. I do not want to hurry you in any way, and I feel that we must see quite clearly what the results of the fighting in the South are going to be. It may carry the provisional government very far. Once the position is appreciated and forces are raised with definite aims and principles, people's minds are changed very much. A gulf opens between them and their past. I always live in hopes that we may come back again to your suggestion of the Craig-Collins Pact to stand together and settle all the outstanding issues in accord. This seems to me to be all the more possible now that you seem to be getting increasing control of the situation in Ulster, and now that Collins has definitely drawn the sword. I do not bother you with minor matters in this letter. although there are several outstanding which cause me anxiety. These we can discuss when we meet, but I feel that we must be on the lookout for an opportunity to deal with the situation on much broader lines than have hitherto been possible. Death was soon to lay its hand upon the two principal signatories of the Irish Treaty. Arthur Griffith died of heart failure, so it is established, on August 13, and Collins himself, moving audaciously about the country, rallying and leading his supporters in every foray, was killed in an ambush on August 22. The presentiment of death had been strong upon him for some days, and he only narrowly escaped several murderous traps. He sent me a valedictory message through a friend for which I am grateful. Tell Winston we could never have done anything without him. His funeral was dignified by the solemn ritual of the Roman Catholic Church and by every manifestation of public sorrow. Then silence. But his work was done. Successor to a sinister inheritance, reared among fierce conditions and moving through ferocious times, he supplied those qualities of action and personality without which the foundation of Irish nationhood would not have been re-established. The void left by the deaths of Griffith and Collins was not unfilled. A quiet, potent figure stood in the background, sharing, like Griffith, the dangers of the rebel leaders without taking part in all that they had done. In Cosgrave, the Irish people found a chief of higher quality than any who had yet appeared. To the courage of Collins he added the matter-of-fact fidelity of Griffith and a knowledge of practical administration and state policy all his own. At his side rose the youthful Kevin O'Higgins, a figure out of antiquity cast in bronze. These men restored order in Ireland by ancient methods and with no great effusion of blood. The people in their turmoil, confusion, and distress felt the stimulus of a willpower calm, intense, and ruthless. The attempt to break down the Dáil by murdering its members individually was countered in the following way. On 2 deputies being shot almost on the steps of the Parliament House, Rory O'Connor and 3 of his leading associates were awakened and shot without trial on a December morning. They had been residing in easy confinement in Mountjoy prison since their surrender at the Four Courts. They met their fate with equal astonishment and fortitude. A year before, Rory O'Connor had been best man at the wedding of Kevin O'Higgins. It is evident that those who judge these events in future time will have to do so with comprehension of the stresses and strange conditions of this period of convulsion. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Cope, August 23. Following for Cosgrave, Duggan, and the Provisional Government. I take the earliest opportunity in this hour of tragedy for Ireland and of intense difficulty for the Irish Provisional Government of assuring you of the confidence which is felt by the British Government that the treaty position will be faithfully and resolutely maintained. The death of the 2 principal signatories, the retirement of another, and the desertion of a 4th, in no way affects the validity and sanctity of the settlement entered into with the plenipotentiaries of the Irish nation. On the contrary, we are sure that the Provisional Government and the Irish people will feel it all the more a sacred duty to carry into full effect the act of reconciliation between the 2 islands, which was the life work of the dead Irish leaders, and with which their names will be imperishably associated. For our part, the word of Britain has been passed and is inviolable. We hold ourselves bound on the treaty basis and will meet good faith with good faith, and goodwill with goodwill to the end. You as acting chairman of the Provisional Government and your civil colleagues and your high military officers may count on the fullest measure of cooperation and support from us in any way that is required. Another man of distinction, ability, and courage fell a victim. Erskine Childers, author of The Riddle of the Sands, who had shown daring and ardor against the Germans in the Cuxhaven raid of New Year's Day 1915, had espoused the Irish cause with even more than Irish irreconcilability. He too was shot for rebellion against the Free State. Said Kevin O'Higgins in public with severity, "If Englishmen come to Ireland looking for excitement, we will see that they get it." He died with the utmost composure. Kevin O'Higgins himself was also in after years to fall by the bullet. Before this closing tragedies, I had ceased to be connected with Anglo-Irish affairs, but when the coalition government resigned at the end of October 1922, the strength and power of the Irish Free State was firmly erected upon the basis of treaty. One of the first decisions of Mr. Bonar Law's cabinet was that the treaty should be made good in letter and in spirit, and this has guided all later British administrations. Who cares to predict the future? Britain is free and Ireland is lonely. Ireland is poor, and Britain is still ploughing through the sombre consequences of Armageddon. Ireland, as a dominion within the British Commonwealth of Nations, has much to give to her neighbour and much to withhold from her. No one can expect that the hatred and prejudices of centuries will pass away in the passage of our short lives, but that they will pass away in the merciful oblivion of time and in the recuperative fruitfulness of nature seems to be a good and fair hope. 50 years of peaceful association and new growth must bring the study of common interests increasingly into prominence. In the undying words of Grattan, "The channel forbids union, the ocean forbids separation." Two ancient races, founders in great measure of the British Empire and of the United States, intermingled in 1,000 ways across the world, and with the old cause of quarrel ended, must gradually try to help and not to harm each other. It may well be that a reward is appointed for all, and that an Ireland reconciled with itself and to Great Britain will on some high occasion claim to guide the onward march, and offer to the British Empire and perhaps to the English-speaking world solutions for our problems otherwise beyond our reach.